Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Promoting Equitable Change Through Creative Placemaking and Complete Streets. My name is Nimol Talai Aziz. I'm a program associate at the National Complete Streets Coalition. And thank you for joining our last webinar of the year in our series, Implementation and Equity 201. National Complete Streets Coalition, a program of Smart Growth America, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan alliance of public interest organizations and transportation professionals committed to the development and implementation of complete streets policies and practices. Complete Streets is the integration of people and place in the planning, design, construction, operation, and maintenance of our transportation networks. We have a truly expert lineup of speakers today who really can speak to the intersection of community, creative placemaking, and complete streets. A brief housekeeping. In the lower left-hand corner, you can see a Q&A chat box. Feel free to use that at any time to type any questions you may have for our presenters, as we'll have a brief Q&A at the end. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers that we have today. First, Ignacio Bunster-Osa, who is on the National Complete Streets Coalition Steering Committee and who will serve as today's moderator. Ignacio is really noted for the design, integration of green infrastructure, community engagement, and public art. He serves as Vice President at AECOM and the Landscape Architecture Practice Leader. Next up, we have Joe Cosgrove from Circulate San Diego. He serves as a Policy Director and develops policy research to enhance innovative and smart growth policies in San Diego. Following, we have Randy Andrade Van Vleck, who is the Transportation and Planning Manager at City Heights Community Development Corporation. He works with residents to facilitate community visioning, planning, and advocacy that has resulted in $180 million in the secured infrastructure funding for under-resourced environmental justice communities in the core of San Diego. And last but not least, we have Ahmed Malanmar, who is a community engagement specialist at the City Heights Community Development Corporation. He has been involved in the Mid-City community for nearly 10 years and played a key role in advocating for the transformative pedestrian improvements at 50th and University Ave, which we will hear a little bit more about today. And with that, I'd now like to pass it over to our moderator, Ignacio Bunster-Osa.
Good afternoon or morning, depending where you might be at this hour. Very nice to have this opportunity to share some thoughts about creative placemaking and complete streets. I'd like to open up with a statement by Lile, artist, founder of Village of the Arts and Humanities and Barefoot Artists. It's it's the introduction to the field guide for creative placemaking related to parks, but I think it applies equally well to streets. This is a booklet that was just published by City Parks Alliance, funded in part by the NEA, and it's a terrific statement of, you can read it on the screen, about the importance of creative placemaking as a community building enterprise. And I think the key here is to the notion that creative placemaking is about community engagement with the eye of transforming the places where people live. And to me, this is akin to the very traditional archetype of community building by barn raising. It's all hands on the project, all hands to try and really build a community social capital by creating place. And really exacting from communities their desires for what a place should be, especially when art is involved. And so many communities have terrific artists that they come to the fore. An example on the screen, 5 Points in Charlotte. This is an enterprise funded in part by the city's neighborhood improvement program, and it's a historic African American community. There's an intersection that has to be designed as part of a streetcar extension. So these are some of the memes of the day: community relationships, rolling up your sleeves and working with them to create places. And this just from a couple of days ago, where the Better Blocks people came in and they began to sort of map out some design ideas, working closely with the community to include very unique paving patterns and colors that all stem from the way the community envisions themselves and see themselves creatively engaging in new space. Modest project, but extremely important to this particular community. And the other aspect to this is the idea of stage making. Streets are the primary focus of what I call civic life and drama in every dimension. They occupy 27% of any particular city, so it's a major chunk of space. And I think streets more and more need to function through technology and flexibility as a can-do-it-all kinds of space. And I think that's different from the idea of a top-down assignment in terms of what lane belongs to what and where people should go, and all the mechanics of control are being, I think, turned upside down by new technologies and the idea of flexible streets. Here you have, for example, Washington Avenue in St. Louis, a very nice street design about 15 years ago. It functions as a plaza. It functions as also a place where you can close the streets and do major festivities, in addition to having retail and all kinds of things of that sort. So, but flexibility, I think, is more than simply apportioning use of space on a street. It's accommodating all the manners of personal mobility that are becoming more and more prevalent. You see them all the time. I encounter every single one of those vehicles on my bike lane as I commute to work, sometimes coming at me. And the speeds at which they move is different. Interestingly, the longboard, the motorized longboard or boosted longboard, I don't think you can for $200 buy anything that can move at 30 miles an hour. And this is especially true in disadvantaged communities because to them sometimes it's the most affordable way to get around. And so how do we construct streets that allow for these kinds of flexible, equitable, universal, truly universal access? And so it comes to the idea that streets are almost self-organizing in the sense that there are no markings, everybody can move, everyone can have equal access to the entirety of a right-of-way, whether you're sitting around, bicycling, walking, or driving. And I will talk about some examples that are trying to do this. And this is a worldwide phenomenon from Guatemala City to Amsterdam, Stuttgart, London, Chile, and other places are transforming parts of their cities in these kinds of self-organizing ways so that everybody is invited to be part of the space. The first example I want to talk to is in Peterborough, Ontario. This is a community about an hour and a half east of Toronto. And it's a project where, because of a storm sewer that has to rip up the street, city officials and community leaders decided to think about, well, what should the street look like? And what they want is basically this kind of flexible street that can function in different ways at different times. And the key to making this happen was, in fact, to turn a two-way, two-lane street into different sections that behave differently, sometimes allowing traffic to face each other and peel off to side streets. Point being that the critical thing is what's in red there, the 30 kilometers per hour design speed, which is about 17.5 miles an hour. And that, I think, is kind of a bit of a magic number because it's been already tested that the impact of a vehicle moving at 17 miles an hour onto a pedestrian, 80% of the time you will not have any injuries, and 90% of the times you will survive the impact. So it's a major definer of what creates social space on a street to be able to have controlled speeds, low speeds that allow every square inch of the space to function in a flexible and accessible way. And in this case, the impact is it gives you much more flexibility as a designer, as a streetscape designer, to move cars out of the way of the street if need be, or transform spaces through technology where cars can function one way during certain hours and in different ways during other hours. And these are just images to showcase the kind of public outreach that was done to basically convince people that this is exactly the kind of environment that they wished they could have, that they talk about, but it's modeled in a way that it becomes feasible and real for them. Another example at the opposite end of the spectrum is a highly densifying area in Southwest Washington, D.C., next to the National Stadium you see there on the lower left. And it's a street that is being purposely designed in this kind of free-for-all, self-organizing way, where there are no curbs. Paving is building side to building side. And the controlling factor is, in fact, where stormwater and vegetation can occur to allow for the flexible movements. So that, for example, in this image, parts of the street can function as almost like a park in the middle with the lanes at either side of that central space, or as areas in which the lanes are in between the trees in the center space. And this is to allow the future of the street to function in different ways, depending on activities, on things that can happen. And parking can be either all or nothing, or in between, or take parking away and put restaurants in place of that. So that's really the intent of that. And you can see in the plan the kinds of activities and how the street can function in a unified kind of way, allowing anyone and everyone to partake of the space in a creative kind of way. And just to emphasize the need to imagine the future where apps, Wi-Fi, sensors, AVs, and so forth are beginning to be the prevalent mode in which you organize streets for community activities, and making them extremely sort of accessible for all kinds of things to happen, which I think is the foundation of any creative kind of enterprise. And just to conclude, I think when we think about the technologies that are coming and how we can apportion and use space, for example, instead of having to put a sign that says no parking deliveries on the street, well, the vendor can decide when the truck is coming and apportion that portion of the sidewalk for that purpose through an app, which is read by the vehicle or by the user driving or by the pedestrian and so forth. And we already have these kinds of technologies related to shared bikes. So we can imagine a future where creativity is in fact unleashed by the use of technology to transform what I said is a 25%, 27% or any urban space. So that's as a matter of introduction to look more specifically at key examples, especially from San Diego. And so you'll hear now from Joe Cosgrove. Joe?
Great. Thanks, Ignacio. How's it going, everyone? I'm here to talk to you today about the progress that we've been making with equitable placemaking in San Diego. So over the past number of years, we've had a grant with or through the Kresge Foundation and Transportation for America, and my organization, Circulate San Diego, was partnered with the City Heights CDC, with Randy and Ahmed, who you will be hearing from a little bit later, and who will discuss the project in detail. So I'm going to be speaking to you today about a model that can be, I'm going to be speaking to you today about a model for achieving equitable policy change. And that model has, on the slide it says 3 steps, but really I think it has 4 components. And the first component that's not on there is the demonstration or the pilot project that Randy and Ahmed will be speaking to you about after my presentation. And that we not only did this work, but we also documented the process, and we documented the successes of it. We documented the barriers of it. We documented the entire process, which was really important. The second component was that we developed and utilized a neighborhood placemaking collaborative, and I'll go into that in detail in a minute. Secondly, or thirdly, we conducted research and created a publication of a placemaking report that we were able to use to leverage for change at the city level. And then fourth, the advocacy and support we provided to the city is helping them adopt a new placemaking permit. So the neighborhood placemaking collaborative that was established during the process of the pilot project and the demonstration project gave us, or was really done in order to ensure that this process that we're trying to develop as a placemaking process for the city would be equitable, and that we would recruit members from every community in San Diego, and that their needs would be felt, and if they had barriers to creating equitable placemaking in their neighborhoods, that we would be able to address it, or at least have a process for addressing it. So first, we convened residents and organizations from various neighborhoods to jointly advocate to the city and find out what solutions would be necessary. This process allowed us to understand why placemaking doesn't work and demonstrate how it can work. So then the second component, or the next component that we undertook was a Place for Placemaking in San Diego report. And at the beginning stages of the process with the neighborhood collaborative, we saw that San Diego had a number of problems when it came to placemaking. So we started doing research on what other cities did and what their solutions were. And really one of the main problems was that developers or people that had the money to do placemaking in the downtown area weren't having as many problems. They were able to get through development services rather easily, and the process wasn't really the same, or it was too burdensome for nonprofits or community groups in other parts of San Diego. So this research led us to believe that there was a lot of value in placemaking and ways that the city could start its own program. So our report elevated and targeted the goals of equitable placemaking in San Diego. It highlighted targeted, reasonable goals for specific city agencies. It provided successful examples and documented their shared barriers to success. And then it highlighted successful strategies that comparable cities utilize to address similar change. So one of the things that we did first in the report, and I think it's really important to do, as Ignacio did as well, is define what we mean by placemaking and make sure that there is an equitable aspect to that. And we use the definition for T4A's, the scenic route, which I'll leave up there for a second, but I would assume that most of you familiar with placemaking know about this definition. So one of the first things that we wanted to do besides document the pilot and demonstration project was we wanted to document other successful placemaking case studies in San Diego to learn what we could from those and why they were able to be built. Did they have grant funding? Did they have some permission from their city council member? So our report detailed why these projects were able to be built and why other ones were not. So after we reviewed these processes and we went through what the projects did, we figured out what some of those projects had to share and what some of their ups and downs were. And we were really interested in what their barriers were. So we started documenting the process for all of these projects, and the case studies allowed us to find a number of barriers. And these were the three that really stuck out and went into the report. And one was it was a complex and expensive permitting process. Placemaking project permits are treated as development projects, and the process is often complicated and expensive for residents. The process wasn't equitable. Residents who can navigate the political system are much more likely to succeed than those without the same experience. And then third, funding for permits is really difficult to find. The city does not currently provide financial assistance to encourage more programs. So our report really wanted to target these issues. And we did that first by looking at what other cities in the country were doing that were comparable or that we could compare San Diego to help build leverage. So the first one was Los Angeles, and we took a few different recommendations from them to create a new user-friendly permit. And then secondly, Los Angeles had pilot projects that they determined if the process is accessible to all, so they documented what that process was. And then thirdly, we looked at Minneapolis, where they're experimenting with and formalizing partnerships with local artists and integrating them into the existing community planning process. And then finally, we looked at a local city in our region, National City, where they're partnering with local arts or community organizations to serve as a conduit for effective community engagement and community placemaking. So we really saw Minneapolis and National City as sort of visionary in what we would like to achieve in San Diego, but we saw what happened in Los Angeles as first steps that we could take to build a placemaking program in San Diego. So the report recommendation, or the main report recommendation that we made, was that the establishment of a new creative placemaking permit in partnership with multiple city departments needed to occur. So finally, to get to the placemaking permit, throughout this process, the neighborhood collaborative that we had been working with was also working with city officials that were interested in placemaking and trying to find solutions to integrate creative placemaking into city policy somehow. So the report and the ongoing advocacy and expertise from the collaborative gave city officials the leverage necessary to support an equitable placemaking permit. And we documented this process, and we published all of our asks with the city so that everybody was aware of this and nobody was left out of this process. So the goals that we had for the permit to make sure that it was equitable was to create a separate over-the-counter process for temporary community placemaking in the public right-of-way and on private property. We wanted to simplify the application material and process. We wanted to lower the costs. We wanted to make sure that a process for intersection murals was included in this over-the-counter process as well, which had to go through much more engineering than some of the other placemaking projects had to do in the past. And then finally, our number one goal was to get the permit approved. The new permit is widely supported and is expected to gain approval in the coming months. So I want to thank you guys for your time, and I want to pass it over to Randy, who is going to talk to you about the demonstration project and equitable placemaking in neighborhoods of San Diego. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks to the National Complete Truth Coalition for this opportunity to share a success story that we've had here in City Heights. Again, my name is Randy Andrade Van Vleck. I work for the City Heights Community Development Corporation. We're a nonprofit based in San Diego in a neighborhood called City Heights. We're a community of about 80,000 people. Since about the late 60s and 70s, City Heights has been a destination for and an enclave for refugees. We saw big diaspora folks from Southeast Asia due to some of the wars and bombings in Vietnam and Cambodia. And then in the 90s, there was also a large Somali enclave and diaspora that settled in City Heights. So City Heights has has historically been a place for new Americans and immigrants to start their lives here. City Heights is a very dense city. As I mentioned, about 80,000 people. Would be the 9th largest city. If we were a city, we'd be the 9th largest city in the whole region. We are part of the city of San Diego. And City Heights Community Development Corporation was founded by residents in the early 80s to respond to deteriorating neighborhood conditions. For decades and decades, City Heights was a neglected community. It was disinvested, and as a result, we have intersections that look like this. It's a unique place in many ways, not only in the sense of the diversity, but looking at the modal patterns, about 90% of kids walk to bike or school to elementary schools, which is far higher than the national average. The transit ridership is some of the highest in the region as well. But unfortunately, people are risking their lives just to get across the street. And this intersection here is at the 50th Street and University area. This photo was taken in 2010. You can see here it's not a safe-looking intersection. There was a lot of speeding that was taking place. Most people don't think that this is a legal crossing, but in California, all intersections are legal crossings unless there's a sign that states otherwise. But there was a lot of people that were crossing here, about 50 people an hour. This was really the center of the East African and Somali community. A lot of economic transactions happening here, a lot of businesses, a high density of businesses. We're here, mosques as well. But the main intersection looked like this. There were a lot of crashes that were taking place, and a couple of people were hit and killed in the years before we began working with the community at this intersection. And due to decades and decades in disinvestment, again, the intersection looked like this. And at one point, this is University Avenue and 50th Street. University, you could see there was a curve actually to it. And the city in the 70s straightened the street out, but they never bothered to straighten the sidewalk out. And unfortunately, that's something that is common for a lot of low-income communities and communities of color that have historically been last in line to receive their fair share of resources. So to really reverse that inequitable distribution, historical distribution, City Heights CDC, launches a number of initiatives that involve working with the residents to build advocacy, power, community engagement, and have residents involved in the planning process. At this intersection, there was a proposal to install a fence in the middle of the intersection, and we thought that was the wrong approach, and resident leaders did too. So we worked with business owners, community leaders, and the city to have the intersection redesigned in 1 year to look like this. This was considered, a big success in the community. There was a lot of support for this. It was pretty quick, actually. This is the first photo was 2010. This is 2011. You could see high visibility crosswalks were installed. We had to remove some parking there. But one of the most unique features is that the left turn pocket was converted into a pedestrian refuge. You can see with the pylon poles there. To do that, we had to get the business owner's support on the north side. He owned a market called Minnehaha Market, a very popular market in the Somali and East African community. The owner's name was Abdi Osman, and when we met with him, he was interested in improving safety here, but of course he was also concerned about his business and was reluctant to give up the intersection, but to give up the left turn. But when he realized that this was a project that was supported by the community that would improve safety, he said he was willing to give up that left turn into his business for this refuge. And I think that speaks to the role of community-based organizations. Because we're here in City Heights, because we're place-based, he knows that we're going to be here. We've been here for 35 years. He knows that we're going to follow through on a larger vision for beautification of this intersection. And just earlier this year, we had the intersection transformed to look like this. You can see the pop-outs there. It's a button-activated beacon. The median is now concrete. And so this is Abdi Osman here with the blue shirt. It's myself, Avital Abudi, Ramla Saeed from the Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans, and Officer Assad Mohammed. And again, back on the community-based organizations and the role of that, when Abdi agreed to have the intersection transformed and give up that left turn pocket, he saw that safety initiative as one step towards a larger vision. That giving up that left turn pocket was couched in a larger vision for beautification. And there was this idea that a lot of leaders had to create an enclave that would really pop with culture, with art, with a name. There was talk about having a name called Little Mogadishu or Little Somalia. And the latest that we have is Little East Africa, and that seems where the most consensus is. And so the Kresge Foundation was interested in launching a placemaking initiative in City Heights, and we thought we had the perfect project with this site here at 50th and University. And there was talk, and Ahmed's going to chat more about this, but there was talk about installing a gathering space, installing art that would reflect the local community identity. And we knew that we needed to have a visioning process for that, so we hired a local community-based organization called the Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans, PANA. These are some of the leaders here from that group. And we also hired a local artist named, their collective is known as Move as One Collective, really talented young men who grew up actually at this intersection. A lot of their parents own businesses here, so they all were friends growing up, childhood friends, and now they have an art collective. Really talented group. One of the artists works for a creative agency called Donda, which was founded by Kanye West. So we brought them on board as well, and luckily the Kresge grant was able to provide resources for that. We had a visioning workshop. About 70 people came out for that. We had different themes at the workshop. One was on pedestrian safety, one was on cultural corridors, and another on gathering space. We had different meetings, different subcommittees that met earlier to kind of come up with questions that they wanted to see addressed at the larger workshop. So there's a lot of kind of groundwork and that went into prepping for this workshop. This photo here is a photo of people raising their hands, as you can see. But the question that we posed was, we asked people to raise their hands if they knew someone who was hit by a car in this area near 50th and University. The entire room raised their hand for that. And it really goes to show you that there's a lot of crashes taking place in City Heights, and we believe it's due to a lack of complete streets. And we want to reverse course on that. But there's a collective trauma felt from the traffic violence in City Heights. So this is the interim improvement that was installed in 2011. These are some of the photos. You can see the gathering is sitting outside is really popular at this location, and Somali culture as well. Ahmed will chat a little bit more about that. But there was no good outdoor seating to do that. You can see kind of folks hunched around like near the fence here, and there's not really it's not really a sittable space. So we wanted to change that. So after the workshop, we wanted to put things in action, and we didn't want to wait years and years for the gathering space to be built. So we decided just to do one DIY style, implement it, and to test out how it would work. But first we had to move some pigeons out of the way, because actually there was a lot of pigeons that were already gathering at the space. And this was kind of an interesting element of the community engagement process. We engaged some of the folks who were feeding the pigeons. We relocated the pigeon feeding area and installed these signs here that some positive messaging for people to know where they could feed the pigeons. And it was really successful. We moved about 100 pigeons off a prominent piece of land, city-owned land, that we used to build a gathering space. We cleaned that all up with the community at a number of different cleanups. And then we just built it. We went to Home Depot, and it was about $1,000 in parts or so, or materials that we purchased, and we just did a build day. We installed these benches here with wood and bricks, and we had different performers. We had a local leader doing spoken word here. In Somalia, Somalia is known as the land of the poet, so very much so an oral culture. And so we wanted to represent that here. And when we kicked off this gathering space, we worked with the local Girl Scouts to have another performance here. And you can see the photos here of, these are some of the leaders from Move as One Design Collective at the gathering space. You can see pretty low cost, just bricks, wood. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Ahmed Maulana, our community engagement specialist, who we also were able to bring on through this initiative to continue to advance the phase of this work.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you. I believe Randy actually talked about CDC's background. I'm not going to go back that. But I'm going to talk about year 2 here, about the implementation of the gathering space. As Mohammed Osman, he is the gentleman who actually runs Move as One Artists. They're the one that collect all the artists. And as you see that board on the side of the right-hand side, he actually created that board, and that board is called Ladu. Ladu is it's a game that was played back home in Somalia at the time, and it brings people together, whether you're at a younger age, older age, you come and sit together. There's 4 people playing, and then the rest are watching from the top, and they play with a dice. So, and then the design of this Ladu, Move as One actually designed it the way it looks right now. I'll show you a better picture of it in the next slide, hopefully. And that design actually came from this particular material. This particular material is called, in the Somali culture, guntino. Guntino is it's a unifabric, the colors that the artist was using to design on the gathering space for this particular location. So, and then this is some of the artists, some of the art that they collected that can represent that area, based as an East African, also the Somali culture as well together. As you can see, it's one of the traditional pictures that they found from back home, and then they want to implement it on this gathering space, so that way it symbolizes the location and the area of the Somali community as well. And the Movers One and their group and some of the people, actually this is a great idea because, and it attracted a lot of people's attention. This was a filter that we used for social media at the time. The filter actually for that time was Snapchat, and they created this so anyone who was at that location at that day, and they take it, they can filter that, and that would come up as well on their filter. And that was a great movement, so that way folks would identify that they're at that gathering space location. And this is some of the arts that they have collected, and the symbols of the stamps showing the history of that particular country to identify that location. Primarily, it is an East African community, but in that particular location, heavily is lived by the Somali community as well. And this particular project is led by the Somali community also at large, within getting a couple of the East Africans on board as well. And then this is some of the arts that they have collected. The shilling, Somalis, this is the stamp. This is, when I was talking about guntino, the fabric, this is how the women were wearing at the time, that particular fabric. It's called unifabric, and this is how they dress up with that particular fabric. That fabric became the background art for that gathering space once I get to the other slides, and you'll be able to see how we utilize this fabric as an art, as a background as well. And this is a cross street, 4-way cross street in the city of Mogadishu. I know most of you might not be familiar. If you are familiar, this is a runabout that's running on the middle of the street. There's a couple of metals across the street, and cars are crossing 4 ways. And Movers One designed it for us, thinking about University and 50th Street. If we get the momentum going based on the community, and the design goes through as a placemaking and get the permit the way we my colleagues here, Joe and Randy, actually talked about, they're pushing the policy for placemaking permit. If we get that done, hopefully this intersection can be converted as a 3 model. I can show you on that, and this is so it can represent what they had home on that particular street. So and it is a very good design. Hopefully right now this is at the talking stage. We're not actually in the implementation on that. We're implementing the gathering space, but hopefully this is the future if we can get that. As Randy mentioned earlier, the crosswalk here on 50th and University, this particular crosswalk, as he mentioned, he skipped about how the left-hand pocket was closed. Now it was added for Abdi, and now Abdi, which is the owner of that store, is happy, and that's what Randy made that happen. And this crosswalk, actually, when people are crossing and they're pushing the beacon button and they safely cross, vehicles, as they drive through, I'll get to the other slide, they slow down because there are people sitting on the right-hand side on the gathering space, and they look at it and say, whoa, why are these people sitting here? What are they doing here? So it creates attention, and then it makes vehicles to slow down so not a lot of pedestrians getting hit a lot. And that's the purpose of the gathering space, it helps safety for vehicles to actually drive slower in that particular area, since there was a lot of a lot of death in the past. And this is one of the meetings that we held, and thanks to Rooted in Place, which is a local artist here and local artists here in San Diego that helped us out implement on this particular, and they collected the information from the community, their ideas, and implemented into a real draft. I'm sorry, I think I skipped a slide. I apologize. And this is one of the community members giving their ideas to the artists, and I'll show you how all the community ideas came about. This is all the drawings that the community said this is how the gathering space should look like. And we collected all these ideas, and I think the meeting we had about 30 or 45 people showed up. Prior to that, for all the other meetings, we had about average of 30 people since the momentum of this the gathering space been going on. And as we come up, we had also some high school students who actually volunteer because they're seniors and they actually need to do community hours to be able to graduate. Osvaldo, the young man who you see sitting on that bench, he built that bench, and that bench, and that is part of his community hours that went into it. And the table, on top of the table, there's a Ladoo board. That Ladoo board is actually what made this gathering space more interesting and more community coming out and actually playing together. As you see the color and the pattern of the actual bench that Osvaldo is sitting on it, that is that fabric I was talking about, the Guntino fabric, which is the unifabric. The painting on that stripes, it's based on that colors. So thanks to Osvaldo on that one. And on the other side, we unveil the actual landscape for how the gathering space should look like. And the community it was an open house. They're looking at it and they have questions, they have ideas, and all this other stuff. Mr. Musa is one of our volunteers who just take his time and come to that area. No one pays him. He picks up trash, clean up, and they take ownership of the location of how it should be able to be maintained. As you see, more community members are actually looking at the unveil, and I'll get to the actual what they're looking at. I'll show you a picture of it, and the Ladoo board is there. And this is Asad Mohammed, and our artist right there. She's actually sharing with him. He's actually been a longtime community member. He's a community relation officer here in the city of San Diego, liaison between the African communities and the San Diego Police Department. He's been very helpful on this project and very supportive. A couple of his actually relatives got hit on this particular street. This is a gentleman who actually came up on the first time, say that, you know what, we should fence this thing down. No, and as dialogue gone on, we actually come up with a better idea, and then he agreed with us that the way we have it today, and it looks, and he's happy. And this is what we unveil, the rooted in place architecture actually put together for this, and all the ideas came from strictly from the community. And this is when we had our open house. The community were looking at it at the time. You saw all the pictures. This is how the gathering space should look like as soon as we get our permitting process going on, because there's a movement going on in the city of San Diego getting a permit. I'll leave that to Randy later on, or Joe will talk about it if they get a chance to any of the questions. So let me, so this is, as you see, the Ladue board is there. This is some sitting areas that were donated by the Business Association, and some landscape, and also a mosaic of camel would be also be placed over there to symbolize the actual significance of the Somali community, because they are people of that they take care of animals and camels and cows, but they like camels mostly than anything else. And this is how it should look like: compact soil, the unifabric that I talked about, the continuo, and the tables playing the Ladue, and then there will be 2 trees under there as well. So. And this is some of the community being happy over there. They're doing the time, and they're very movement. That is one of our partners at the beginning of the first year of this one, and a couple of the community members showing up for support as well. This is when I visited in Minneapolis, the Walking Summit. One of the things that we probably implement, the street name is 50th and University right now. Hopefully the idea behind it is to see if we can rename that street, maybe Little East Africa. That's the movement that's going on right now at the moment. And Minneapolis is way ahead of us, because it is the melting pot of Somali community. They're the largest community in the nation. And this is Cedar Side River. Some of you might know, and some of you might not know. They have Somali Street. They changed the street name to where that neighborhood, and now that community actually has significance of that in that area, and it's very clean and very nice. We enjoyed with the community of St. Paul, the Roundup communities, and all that other stuff. And now I'm going to pass over my presentation to Ignacio, and Ignacio will continue from here. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I will get back to you.
Thank you, Ahmed. That was really wonderful success, both you and Randy, and certainly the process that John talked about. But there's been there a number of you asked some, I think, very interesting questions, and I'd like to address a couple of them. I think the first one came in about security. When you create places that are attractive for people to gather in numbers, and as we've seen tragically, there are now places that can be targeted for mayhem, and so the question is, well, how do you address that? And there are obviously a number of questions, answers to that, from very permanent and sometimes unsightly kinds of defense barriers, such as you find in Wall Street. But I think in other cases, it's really working with local security police, organizations and departments to block streets on a temporary basis as events happen. I just saw this past weekend in Raleigh, a parade, and basically they were blocking the streets that would allow any vehicle from accessing beyond the security sort of perimeter. So this is something that has to be worked out. Obviously, it's a new sort of game in town for designers, and I think local organizations and communities and police departments have to engage in that. I'd like to ask the co-presenters to address this question, which I think was very, very interesting, and I'll read it out. If I can find it here, just a minute. But basically, it had to do with what is the balance between accommodating culture of new Americans, immigrants, with the unity of American culture. And I think this, strikes a wonderful, note about, well, what is the role of diversity in cultures in the country, and how do we express them physically in the urban environment. So I don't know if one of my other co-presenters want to address that. No?
Okay. Can you repeat that, Ignacio, for that question again? I'll see if I could.
Yes. What is the balance between accommodating culture of new Americans with the unity of American culture?
Terrific. Okay, yeah. As new Americans, myself speaking for one of them, is that, there are organizations that has been rooted here and prior the newly Americans' arrivals, like the City Heights Community Development Corporations, and all their mission and vision was that making sure that disadvantaged communities or communities that's not being served and the needs of, that's what they're there for. And the cultural competence allows them to be able to introduce an aspect of making sure that ESL classes and making sure that they understand the American culture and providing transportation and services, all those needs, and also affordable housing, because the city of San Diego, as you know, is a very expensive place to live. Those are the things that allowed Native Americans to engage and to be part of the community that they're in right now.
Right. Thank you. And I think an attendant question to that was that sometimes cultural corridors are occasionally criticized as being exclusive because they have such a tight identity to the group that has made them. And so what is the feedback in your case, Ahmed, about inviting other members of the community to come into these spaces and use them?
My feedback onto that would be the other communities are open to this particular gathering space specifically because it is in the middle of the City Heights, actually right on the middle of prior getting to college and Euclid and there. I was actually there on the other day, and there were a couple of immigrant and non-refugee folks came in and just sit down and say, "Oh my God, this is a place to relax. Is this only for the Somalis?" I said, "No, this is for everyone. You're welcome." So it opened that door that now it shows the cultural competence, as well as cultural sharing gathering space, where folks are now sharing with the Hispanic community, the white community, and Asian community that's there, and actually talking about it. And there's a tea shop right there. The idea behind it is folks are grabbing a tea, sitting on the gathering space, and doing a tea talk, like just having the ordinary conversation that anyone should have.
That's great. Thank you. Before passing it on to Nimotolai for some concluding remarks, I'd like to say that the impressive thing about these efforts to me is the idea of finding lost space in cities, because whether it's an intersection that you're making more habitable by expanding a sidewalk or creating a median, or finding a side space where you were feeding pigeons, that all of a sudden they become active, creative, well-designed, well-conceived, have a sense of identity where none existed before. And I think our cities are just replete with places and opportunities to make something out of ignored or lost kind of spaces in cities. So that's great. Thank you. Nimotolai?
Hi, thank you, Ignacio. Thank you for everyone who tuned in and listened today. And just again, thank you to our presenters based in San Diego, as well as our moderator today, Ignacio from AECOM. Just a few quick announcements. If you enjoyed everything you heard today, talking about complete streets, as well as creative placemaking, Smart Growth America and the National Complete Streets Coalition will be hosting our second national conference in partnership with Transportation for America's Arts and Culture team. This conference will be in Nashville, April 3rd and 4th. So imagine 1 hour webinar into 2 days this April, Intersections Creating Culturally Complete Streets. Registration is now open, and we are also accepting session proposals. So if anyone on the line has any ideas they would like to share with the broader audience, this is a great opportunity to submit a session proposal before next Friday, December 1st. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Another quick announcement, the National Complete Streets Coalition, this month we announced that we are updating the way we grade complete streets policies across the country. We had a framework that we had started when the movement began in 2004, and we're now calling for more requirements from all cities and towns that adopt complete streets policies to include more implementation steps and increased equity, so complete streets can be benefited from all. We will be having a webinar on this new grading framework December 1st at 1 p.m. So feel free to register for that following webinar as well. Again, thank you to our presenters and thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.